We're not going to retreat. We're not going to surrender. We're not going to quit. Fight, fight, fight. Amen.
Now, that was such an extreme thing to do that Jordan Bardella, he's a leader of the French National Rally, so their far-right party, has cancelled his planned speech to CPAC this weekend because he now thinks that the stain of Nazism hangs over the conference. Now, of course, Trump will still happily be attending on Saturday. Let's go to Bannon once more, though, because in his speech he also said this.
The future of MAGA is Donald J. Trump. We want Trump in 28. That's what they can't stand. A man like Trump comes along only once or twice in a country's history, right? We want Trump. 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 We want Trump.
Now, I suppose one of the reassuring is the wrong word, but sort of one of the silver linings maybe of the Trump presidency is that it's difficult to see how you build the coalition Trump did without Trump's sort of, unique charisma, right? You'd imagine if Steve Bannon or someone stood for presidency and with exactly the same politics as Trump, they probably wouldn't win. And so therefore the fact that Trump can't stand again in 2028, according to the American Constitution, was a bit of a relief. Lots of people now floating the idea that maybe he will stand for a third term. Is this, I suppose one interpretation of the two clips we've just shown is that Steve Bannon is desperate for attention, which is, I think, highly plausible. Do you think there is a danger, though, that we could end up with Trump sort of changing the Constitution or breaking the Constitution and standing for a third term?
You could change the Constitution. You're allowed to change the Constitution. FDR did 3 terms. You're allowed to change the Constitution. I suppose they could make it quite clean and say you can't serve more than 2 consecutive terms. But then, of course, so what he would run again in 2028, and maybe in 2032, you've got Steve Bannon ahead of 2032 saying, no, we need Trump to run again. He's going to, at some point, be too old to run. He's going to be will he be an octogenarian, I think, Michael, in 28? He's getting on now, right? He'll be close to 80 by then. I think he'll be over 80 by then.
He's 78 now.
Yeah. So he'll be 82 months away. He'll be 83 probably by the time of the next election. And then if you were to do a full term after that, you'll be 87. I can't see how you do more. Maybe, right? Maybe. He's a very wealthy man and it's a country with very advanced medical technology if you have enough money. So maybe. Although I think probably the diet of Diet Cokes and double cheeseburger and fries probably won't help. Maybe. So I think they probably could change it if they wanted to. There's not really much of a groundswell for it at the moment. But it's something I think about a lot, Michael. Donald Trump is going right now, hell for leather, 100 miles an hour. Why? Because the midterms are going to be in 20 months' time. And as soon as you've had those midterms, people will be talking about Trump's successor. And I think, we shouldn't just look at this as a 4-year presidency. It's effectively a 2-year presidency. Because that final 2 years, a large part of it is going to be who comes after Trump. It'll be a huge political story. And I think that will really anger and upset Trump because, he'll be in the autumn of his, or the winter, coming up to the winter, the final years of his, not just his political career, but also, in all probability, his life. And people will be talking about somebody else, and that will really upset him. So I can see why he would pivot into the possibility of a second successive term. But ultimately, I think, age will come for him. It is important to say, Michael, the US Constitution can be amended. There are many amendments, mostly they're good amendments. And Trump supporters would say, well, this is another good amendment. And at the same time, let's try and zone out here and not be too hypocritical, Michael. We've had prime ministers in this country for a lot longer than 8 years. Okay? We had Margaret Thatcher from 79 to 90. We had John Major from 97 to 2007. So I think it would be a little bit hypocritical to say, oh my goodness, you're serving more than 8 years. That's not allowed. Well, that's precisely what we've done. Other countries, of course, have had prime ministers serve for a lot longer. I think the durability of the American Republic for a quarter of a millennium really goes hand in hand with the impossibility of a single individual accumulating sufficient power to serve more than 2 or 3 terms in the case of FDR. And clearly Trump represents something of a challenge to that. But, these things have happened. Amendments have happened. So I think it's plausible. And I do think, Michael, there is a ready-made replacement for him. Obviously, he hasn't got the same brand for now, but J.D. Vance does strike me as a really potent politician. I saw his Munich speech, actually. He was kind of umming and ahhing and wasn't a great orator. But he's only been in this game for, 5, 6, 7 years. as a senator, as a person in public life. I think, by the end of his first term as a vice president, he'll be pretty well equipped to run for the top job, particularly after 2 terms. I mean, I think he would be really well equipped. He'd be early 50s by then. A lot of experience under his belt. He's clearly doing a lot of work on the foreign policy side with Rubio as Secretary of State. So I do kind of feel like that movement has an heir apparent. I don't think it'd be somebody like Steve Bannon. I do think Vance is very, very well placed for it. The curveball is, of course, one of the Trump kids, Donald Jr. They are. Donald Jr. actually is a moderately competent person, but I can't really see it. So it would have to be Vance. But yeah, I don't think you can write off two successive terms, and that would need an amendment, but it's quite plausible. Otherwise, I think another option is they just gerrymander the system for another Republican to win who's not Vance, but they really, really gerrymander the system in a way that we've not really seen yet. And by the way, they already do that, right? It's much harder to vote in swing states as an African American than as a white American for reasons. It's to stop Democrats winning. It's to make it harder for Democrats to win. That already happens. They could put that on steroids, I guess.
I've got one more clip to show you. Obviously, the debate about whether Trump and the Trump administration is fascist comes up a lot. I'm kind of agnostic on the question because I think it's semantic, right? There are lots of people who argue that something is only fascism if it sort of arises, if it's an organized party with street violence and arises specifically sort of as a coalition between business elites and sort of the masses or sort of a mobilized mass to keep down an organized left. So you can only really have fascism when there is a threat of socialist revolution, right? So that's why you get it in the 30s. I'm agnostic. I don't have a strong opinion either way. But there have been a sort of few moments when I've looked at what Trump and Musk and his administration are doing where it just feels so fascist, it can't really be ignored. And this is the latest one. It's a video posted on the White House, the official White House Twitter account, shared with the caption, ASMR, illegal alien deportation flight. And I just find that, I mean, I started the show kind of talking about taboos, right? The Nazi taboo, which is that you sort of, that used to be an insult. And now you've got sort of political parties who are trying to normalize it, sort of trying to say, oh, well, maybe it was a Nazi salute, maybe it wasn't. It's no longer seen as something that no one would ever want to associate with. And I think this kind of breaks a similar taboo, which is, you shouldn't celebrate the lowest point of someone else's life, right? I don't actually think that any kind of deportation is outrageous. I think that you have to have controlled borders, and that's going to involve some deportations, especially of people who've broken the law, right? I'm not against all deportations, but I think the idea that you celebrate someone in their lowest moment is just obscene. And you might say, well, if you're fine with the policy, then who cares about the PR they do around it? I do think that the idea that you shouldn't celebrate misery actually does restrain policy to some degree. And I talked about it on a previous show. I think there's Tom Holland talks about, I mean, he's a massive liberal. He talks about it in his book, where he's talking about sort of like this Nietzschean ideology, which was sort of the Nazi one, which was to say there are great men and we have to all sort of wallow in this sort of warlike greatness where we destroy people weaker than us. And which is very sort of anti-Christian, which is to say the last will be first. We should really respect people who are in more vulnerable positions, not celebrate their destruction. And I do think that there is this sort of Nietzschean Nazi celebrating in strength and celebrating in the destruction of the lives of people who are in a more vulnerable position, which I just think is really, really revolting. Aaron, I want to know what your response was to that video, again, from an official White House account.
Yeah, disgusting. I mean, there's a clear theatre of cruelty going on. And this is for a certain audience and to show, look, we're really getting on top of this issue. That only goes so far, by the way. If you still see reports of things happening, which were happening before, drugs crossing through the border or a homicide which happens to involve an undocumented person, etc. That only goes so far. PR only goes so far. I just want to read, you mentioned Christianity, Michael. This is from the Epistle of James. The book of James. Come now, you rich people, weep and wail for the miseries that are coming to you. Your riches have rotted and your clothes are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have rusted, and their rust will be evidence against you, and it will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure for the last days. The wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous one who does not resist you. This sounds like Bernie Sanders. So, on steroids. So this idea that Christianity is somehow, aligned in terms of values, or the gospel at least, that's not the gospel, that's later on in the New Testament. But the idea that, let's say the New Testament, is aligned with what the Trump White House is doing, and this theater of cruelty from people like Vance, etc., is just completely off. It's just completely off. And I think it goes back as well, Michael, to the conversation we're having in this country right now about woke. Is it, using the R word? That's not a result of woke, right? People were told not to use the R word when I was a kid growing up in the 90s. And you would have conservative teachers tell you that. Why? Because it's just bad manners. It's just rude. There but for the grace of God go I. That could be you in this situation which you're mocking, so don't do it. And I don't think that's like a left-right thing. That's just a civilized, sensible thing, or at least it wasn't until quite recently, Michael, that people with any sort of moral core whatsoever, they would comport themselves like that. And it is really interesting, like you say, to see the US right, the ruling faction of the US right, going this wacky Nietzschean. I think fundamentally, people say post-liberal. I also think weirdly post-Christian, because they don't see the possibility, the plausibility of a universal human subject, which of course, Christianity and Islam do see precisely that. They see an ethnic other who's there to be mocked, derided, and fundamentally presented as less than human. That is not an impulse from the New Testament. Of course, Christians have done very bad things in the past. I'm not suggesting otherwise. But certainly in modernity, when contemporary politicians have tried to mobilize rhetoric and trying to present themselves as upstanding figures of moral authority, you don't do that. Certainly in Britain, right? Centre-right Christian COE Tories do not do that. It's not the done thing. It's ungenteel. It's impolite. It's really unbecoming. And I think it's really right for you to highlight that the US right, the Republicans, Trumpism is going in this new, dangerous, right now quasi-fascist direction, because I think we have to have quite a clear definition of what fascism is. But this is absolutely the same key as fascism. Absolutely the same key. Absolutely the same thought architecture.